Okay, are we ready to start? Welcome, everybody. A few people may join us, but I'm conscious that time goes very quickly. We think we have an hour, and we think that that's a long time, but it will be gone before we know it. Really delighted that so many of you have joined us for this webinar as part of Dying Matters Awareness Week, which has got a focus about talking about death at work. I'm Simon Blake. I'm the chair of the campaign, and I'm also the chief exec of Mental Health First Aid England in my day job, and chair the Support After Suicide Partnership. So this is an issue which is really close to my heart, and you're obviously all here because you share our mission to support people to open up the conversations around dying and our grief, part of everyday experience and a very common part of working life, but one that is often not talked about. Recent research from the campaign has shown that almost 40% of people have lied about needing time off owing to discomfort around talking about bereavement in the workplace, with fewer than 1 in 5 managers feeling very confident supporting someone they manage with bereavement. Now, we all know that death, dying, and grief will affect everyone at some point in their lives. It affects all of us at some point in our lives. But clearly, many workplaces are not set up to support their employees through one of the most difficult times that people have. By talking with those around us, we can make a difference in our workplaces, helping to make it become a place that supports its people when they're ill, caring for those around them or have lost someone close to them. But for many people, the question is, of course, where do we start? And we hope that today you'll pick up some practical advice, some tips and tricks on how to start workplace conversations on this often taboo subject. As I said, I'm the chair of the Dying Matters campaign, and the reason that I feel so passionately about this is that in the last 7 or 8 years, both my brother and my mum have died. I've had very different experiences of the workplace response to those deaths, and that's the immediate family, and of course have friends and colleagues and others along the way. And I think whilst the conversations may not always be easy, it's important we have them because the silence is harder. We're really lucky today to have a superb panel with us. So Aongola Simuyemba, who's the bereavement lead analyst at Monzo, the online bank. Aongola focuses on building and evolving Monzo support structures when supporting next of kin through bereavements. Aongola has been involved in Dying Matters since 2022, when he took part in the Dying Matters Portrait series, exploring the universal yet unique experience of grief with world-renowned photographer Rankin. I'm seeing a few people talking about sound. Can I just check? Is there anything that I'm doing wrong? Are some people able to hear very clearly? Some people are hearing clearly.
You'll find, Simon, you'll find for me, so I think it might be worth checking for other people on their end.
Perfect. Okay, good. I shall carry on. So if you can all check on your end and check connections, check your sounds, etc. Brilliant. We've also got Faith Holloway. Faith leads the Compassionate Employers programme, which is delivered by Hospice UK. Compassionate Employers is a workplace wellbeing programme which helps organisations look after their people through grief, dying and caring. Faith is a frequent keynote speaker and writer and actively promotes open discussion on death and dying in the workplace and advocates for paid bereavement and carers leave. So the format of today, we're going to start with a discussion. I'm going to ask the panel some questions. And then there'll also be a chance for you to ask questions and for us to respond to those. So Aongola, perhaps I can start with you. We know that many of us find it hard to discuss death and dying with friends and family, let alone colleagues. What would your top 3 pieces of advice that you would give to someone wanting to talk to and support a recently bereaved colleague?
Hello. Thank you very much for this opportunity, first of all. And to jump kind of straight into the question, I think the first and the primary thing I would advise, and the top tip I would give, is creating a safe space. Work nowadays looks very different for everyone. We may be remote, we may be hybrid, it might be really formal environments, or it might be really informal environments in which we do our most and sometimes our best work. So I think reflecting that and creating those safe spaces, which might mean leaving the office and going to sit in the corner of a local coffee shop for 10 minutes, or it might mean organizing a hangout in advance, or offering the opportunity for someone experiencing kind of grief and wanting to open up, giving them the opportunity to create those spaces, be it a virtual meeting and whatnot. So I think the first and a really important one is creating that safe space. A second one is also being transparent that there isn't a magical script that someone is going to say that's going to make everything at work better or different, and being honest and open with that. People will be much more open and receptive to sharing their situation if they feel that the person they're talking to isn't going to come back with a beautifully polished, clean response that might seem overly rehearsed, and being open and willing to say there may not be a clean, simple solution or answer at the end of this conversation, and allowing for that space. And the third option, I think it's reassuring. It's reassuring that even if people haven't yet opened up and may not have ever opened up about their past, creating an environment in which that conversation is allowed and is encouraged. So for the people who haven't yet kind of reached that stage in their experience to want to share it with work, or feel that they're able to share it with work, they can see that the environment around them is still open to it.
Oh, I think you're on mute for me, Simon, but I'm assuming that you were passing over to me.
I was, sorry, yeah.
That's okay. Hi, everyone. Who knew we could get 600 people on a Teams call? This is amazing. So thank you so much for being here. Yeah, I think I definitely firstly echo what Aongola's just said there about the polished. It really reminded me of someone we had in a training that I was running quite recently, which is one we do at Compassionate Employees, about managing difficult conversations. And I remember one of our attendees said to me, you know, someone in my team has recently been bereaved. I really care about this person. We're quite close as colleagues, and the days are ticking on, and I'm just not saying anything because I don't know what to say, and I don't have the right thing to say. And it's, you know, I could feel like the palpable stress that she was feeling of the fact that she hadn't acknowledged this. And the way she articulated it was so kind and so warm. You know, I really care about this person. I'm really feeling for him and his family. I wish I could do something, but I know I can't. And I let her go on, and you could see everyone in the room was kind of smiling because they could see that you could feel the care that she had for this colleague. And at the end, the challenge I kind of gave to her was, well, what if you just said everything that you had just said to me? Like, what would be so wrong with saying that, and saying that you're finding it difficult, or saying that you don't know the words? Because that's often the most common barrier, is we think it has to be perfect, exactly like Aongola said, it has to be polished. And actually, I know when I was bereaved, I didn't want someone to give me a polished, perfect answer. I just wanted them to be human, and I wanted them to kind of acknowledge the gravity of what was going on for me. And I think it actually sets a really nice precedent when we talk about these conversations in a messy way, or kind of say it in a clumsy way. It's saying, you're human, I'm human, I don't really know what to say, I don't really know what's going on with you, but we're here to have this conversation, and let's just have it anyway. So definitely echo that. I think my second piece of advice, which is something I was reflecting on this morning, is, you know, in the whole time I've worked in bereavement, or previously working in wellbeing roles, the number one thing that someone will ask me is, what should I say? Give me the words, give me that perfect thing to say. You must have something really good, give me all your best bits. And I find it really interesting that no one has ever asked me, how do I be a good listener? And I think that tells us so much about the way we think about these conversations, as we're really preoccupied with responding and reacting and having solutions. And we're not concerned with, how do I make sure someone feels heard? How do I make them feel safe? How to create those open spaces like Aongola's mentioned? So I would reiterate that. We're not having a conversation specifically about that, but anyone who is listening, a book I highly recommend, it's probably the most influential book in my work, is Listen by Catherine Mannix. She is incredible. I love her. I'm such a fangirl of her work. Do read that book. I think it's fantastic. And my final piece of advice, thinking about the support piece of that question, is, when we have these conversations, it's not the end. I think sometimes we think, okay, I've had that conversation, it's off my plate, I don't have to think about it. It's actually just the beginning. That person is going on a huge journey and you need to be with them on that journey. So don't stop there, carry on having the conversations with them. And particularly the thing that I see employers miss is when people return to work. So that's a huge make or break moment, I think. And I've actually heard people say to me, that was the moment I decided to leave, or that was the moment I realized that my employer is actually really compassionate and really cares about me, is how much thought and time goes into that return to work plan. So when people come back, I think Aongola, you mentioned, a coffee shop or just having that space, have a chat with them before they come in. Don't let them come into that office by themselves and feel alone in that process. Be with them for that journey, and don't just end at that conversation. So yeah, that's where I would start. I feel like I could say a million things, but those are the kind of three that came to mind.
Thanks, Faith. And I think what really shines through from both of your answers is there is no one set answer. We will never get it perfectly right. And also, I think it's really important that we're all recognise the individuality of people. So I had the enormous privilege of living with Mum while she was dying. We knew that she was dying, and people kept saying, you need to take time off work. And I was like, no, I need to be at work. But if I start becoming a pest and start becoming a problem for you, and obviously in a particular role as a chief exec, please then be direct and clear with me that my behavior isn't helping. So that sort of bit, whereas for other people, the taking time off may have been the most important thing, but for us, there was very much, the piece about, or for me, very much about structure. And so there is no one way fits all, but I think giving people permission to say, this is how it would work best for me. We don't know best for other people, but having the whole process by which we just recognise that we need to have the conversation is really, really important. So one of the reasons we're having this conversation is because it is a stigmatized, and Faith used the word difficult conversations earlier. One of the things which I'm really keen on a personal level is we start talking about these things as conversations that some people find hard rather than difficult conversations. They are not innately difficult. And in my experience, I've worked in all sorts of issues which people may find difficult to have conversations about. But we often find that when children are 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, they don't have any difficulty talking about these issues and are much better at. We learn to be, we learn the stigma, we learn to find things difficult. So, Faith, I'm going to come straight back to you and just say, where have you seen employers normalising conversations about death within the workplace? And then I'm going to ask you to just describe in a bit of detail how you do it, because when you told me about your approach at Monzo, it was really, really impressive, in terms of the way that you dealt with it. So, Faith, so some overview about how people do it, and then a bit of a case study with Aongola.
Sure, yeah. I think what I see our compassionate employers members do really well when it comes to normalizing conversations, or I think something that's really important to think about when we're normalizing conversations is backing that up with the support offer. So I think something I'm always very conscious of is almost leading people out to have these really vulnerable conversations where they share quite personal and sensitive things, and then they don't receive the support that they're expecting, and it almost makes them withdraw even more or less likely to do it in future. So I think something I'm always very conscious of, and something I always really advocate for, is if you're going to ask people to come to you with something personal, whether that's bereavement, it could be mental health, it could be the menopause, financial issues, whatever it is, make sure that you're not then leaving them to figure that out on their own. So if you're going to go out and say, let's have this conversation, let's talk about grief in the workplace, which is obviously what we're hoping people do after this conversation, also be ready to have some tough conversations around, we've been challenged before by employees of, this is all well and great to have this conversation, but we only have 3 days bereavement leave. So how helpful is this conversation or me to share that I've recently been bereaved when you're not going to give me the time off that I need to be with my family? So if we're going to normalize those conversations, my challenge, or I guess my question to put to anyone that's listening is, do you know your bereavement leave policy? Do you know what support is offered? How many people are taking up your offers of those support? Do they even know it exists? Because oftentimes people don't. So I think it has to be a kind of double approach in that sense, that if you're going to normalize conversations, have something to back it up with. In terms of what I've seen really effectively normalize those conversations, senior leaders play a big part. I think oftentimes senior leaders can underestimate just what an impact they have in terms of setting that tone and setting that culture. So, people like yourself, Simon, who go on LinkedIn and go on social media and go on webinars and talk about your own experience. You started this conversation talking about your own bereavement experience. And I think things like that are very powerful for people to see people in a CEO role or a director role or a trustee saying, like, this is on the table, this is okay to talk about. Because again, I think asking someone who's in a junior role or just starting in their career to talk to you about their bereavement, I know when I started my job, I would not have been comfortable sharing that. But if, a great manager or a great leader had started that conversation for me, I would have felt enabled to kind of piggyback off that. So good role modeling and backing it up, I think, is my two main takeaways.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Faith. Aongola.
That's amazing. Thank you very much for all of that. In terms of our experience, and my own experience, because again, a lot of my interaction began with my own experience and exploring that. The first and impactful thing that we did and that we now continue to do is to have those, like I shared, that private space and that private environment to have that first initial conversation. After I experienced the death of my grandma and my auntie within a week of each other, I again was understandably shocked, and I didn't really know how to approach work, how to approach kind of the conversation, and how I was attempting to juggle and manage the various different things that happen when you experience something like that and try to come to terms with what a normal may look like. And one of the first things that my managers did at the time was just ask me how I would like to, first of all, how I would like to handle the next day, the next 2 days. And we didn't immediately dive into, okay, unravel everything that's happened and tell us how we can help you, because I had no idea what help really looked like or what I needed to support me for the next couple of weeks, couple of months. It was just managing that immediate next 24 hours of work. So the first step was just opening up and asking me what I would like to do just to handle that next day. That was really empowering for me, because again, sometimes the first thing is just getting over that first hurdle or that next hurdle in front of you. Within that conversation, something that we encourage across Monzo is teams and groups of people having the safe spaces to have conversations with people outside of what we do in our day-to-day roles in the company, but have conversations around like-minded or similar topics or things that we enjoy doing together. So that was another thing that I was encouraged to do, and we encourage each other to do at Monzo, is seek support from the people who support us anyway. So prior to my experience, I spent time talking to people about music. I spent time talking to people about photography and travel. And these were people who were aware of what was going on in my life because of the conversation and relationships that we built. So not solely relying on one person was really supportive as well. And that's something else that we encourage, that everyone plays a part in that support, and it's not, it doesn't solely fall onto the one person who happens to be someone's manager at the time, or someone's someone who organizes something that we do day to day to manage and be involved in that conversation. So the support came from the people who I talked to anyway. My manager helped me understand that next 24 hours of work and navigate that, and also plan ahead. And in that planning ahead, we got to kind of naturally unravel the impact that I was dealing with. My family passed away in Zambia, which is thousands of miles away. So that's a very different scenario to people who may experience their bereavement at that time or in an expected scenario. So the organization and the next steps were different. So the environment allowed me to work with that and work through that, which meant sometimes I had to jump off and take phone calls, taking into account time differences, and help organize things that pulled me away from work for maybe 10, 15 minutes here or there. And being able to understand that in that the practical steps, while also having the conversational support from people. So there were two really helpful things. And that impacts work. Sometimes we may not be able to address the things that we were doing yesterday immediately. It might be really difficult to try and pick up that work at 1,000 miles an hour that everyone does. And that was also reflected in those conversations.
Thank you, Aongola. And I think that's a really important point, isn't it? About saying, and what does this mean for your work? And we've seen lots of bits in the chat about compassionate leave. Those are other days, and whether that's 3 or 5 or 10, or whether it's referred to close family, and who's to define who where grief applies, and all of those sorts of things. But the key bit is also what do you need, but also how does this impact your work, so you don't have that additional worry in relation to work being delivered or not being delivered, and concerns in relation to that. You've touched a little bit, both of you, about this previously, but one of the questions which we get asked time and time again is about language, and we get asked that by mental health first aiders, and I know that many people, managers, the fear is of getting it wrong, and I would just be keen to just explore a little bit more about perhaps what the top tips would be for doing what we can to find a way through, whether you're a manager, whether a peer, all of those sorts of things. As you say, Aongola, it isn't just a manager's responsibility, it's all of our collective responsibility. So what sort of language would you encourage people to think about using? Aongola, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I think it can be as kind of foundational as, are we asking open questions? Are we asking closed questions? Do we want someone to give us or share something relatively specific, or do we want to encourage kind of a dialogue and a conversation? Sometimes, again, kind of being on both sides of a conversation, sometimes those closed and direct questions are really helpful to start and spark that conversation. So really direct things like, do you feel like this is going to impact, or do you think that the things that you're expected to do today will be impacted by this? Some things that might just be a yes and a no. Sometimes just to open what can be a really difficult dialogue. As long as, again, the language that is used is rooted in compassion and empathy, and we are willing to have that conversation and sometimes slow it down and clarify words and clarify the phrases that we may use, and understand, again, that some of this may feel uncomfortable, and sometimes it is that discomfort that creates those the moments of confusion. As long as that is as transparent as possible, I think you can set yourselves up for a hopefully productive conversation, productive, impactful, however it may be steered. But yeah, I sometimes just founding it in some relatively closed questions. Do you want to have this conversation now, or do you want to meet in half an hour after you settle in? Do you want to have this conversation here, or do you want to go sit outside on a bench? Tell me how you're feeling. Can be really open and closed, but ultimately they all lend to being able to lead towards a conversation.
Thanks, Aongola. And one of the things that just reminded me as you were speaking is, of course, for one of the things which I think is interesting is in our world in the moment we're bereaved, it can be all consuming, and it can be all consuming for a week, for 2 weeks, for 3 months, you know, but sometimes it could be like, oh, well, they were nice to me on the first day and asked the question on the first day, but had forgotten by the third day, or yeah, of course. And I'm seeing people talking about anniversaries in the chat. Yeah, it is on. It is unlikely that a manager or somebody will remember perhaps that it's an anniversary. So how do we facilitate and encourage people to say, do you know what, the next period is going to be difficult, or I find Mother's Day difficult, or whatever it is, so that those sorts of conversations keep on happening just as part of everyday practice. It doesn't just finish the first time that we are yeah, within a week, you know, of being back, but actually this goes on for much longer. Faith, anything that you want to add? I'm conscious that time is, as always, galloping away with us, and we're going to get onto questions soon. But anything you want to add to what Aongola's just said?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think I agree in terms of you know, keeping it open, keeping it transparent, keeping it kind of tailored to the person. I think there's definitely some things I don't try to be too prescriptive with what people say or don't say. I think the thing I've seen people least enjoy or find helpful is probably trying to do this weird kind of optimistic spin that we sometimes do with death, which is, you know, well, at least they had this, and at least, you know, they weren't in pain, and you know, we try to put a spin on it. And I think, you know, follow the person's lead. If they're very upset about someone who has died, maybe lean into that feeling with them and don't try and spin it. I think because we're uncomfortable talking about it, because we just want to get back to having that light, fun relationship with that colleague, we almost minimize and isolate them even further by doing that. And I think as you were posing the question, my main thought was, my question to employers would be, if you're finding that people are really worried about these conversations, think about what maybe that tells you about your wider culture. I think I often say to people, you can get this conversation wrong, you can apologize, you can correct yourself. I've had to do that in conversations before, where I've had to say, you know what, that came out really wrong, or, you know, the way that I worded that was really off. Can I try that again? Or can I, you know, now that I understand a bit more, can I ask you that question in a different way? And that's completely fine. But I think if people are so scared to get things wrong, it says something potentially about your wider culture, that people aren't prepared to be vulnerable. They're not prepared to get things wrong because they're just not seeing that happen in your organization. If you don't share your failures as much as you share your successes, people will be terrified to fail in your organization, and you will fail at this conversation at some point. I've had many of these conversations and I've not always got them right, but I have always found a way by the end of the conversation to wrap it up in a way that the person understands my intention and understood that I wanted that conversation to go well. And then they leave that conversation and go, you know what, it's fine. We all screw up. We all say weird, clumsy, you know, things sometimes, or say something in a panic. That's fine. And then I can leave that conversation going, well, at least I tried. At least I did my best. At least I said something. So that would maybe be my challenge to people as well, is if people are really scared to have these conversations, or if your managers, if the number one thing they're saying to you is, I don't want to get this wrong, ask yourself where they're getting this idea that they can get it wrong. Why are they so scared of failing? Why are they so scared of messing up? Because if you're scared to mess up, you're not going to do it in the first place. But you can apologize and you can bring it back. I've resurrected many terrible conversations over my career, whether it's about, not always about grief, but, just performance conversations, or kind of conversations that, were tricky or kind of difficult to navigate. It'll be messy, and sometimes it's a bit uncomfortable, like Aongola said, but yeah, you can make mistakes. It's fine. We're not always going to get it perfect.
And of course, that silence is very loud.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, perhaps the thing that you can't that silence is probably always wrong. At least offering people the opportunity to speak. And yeah, I think exactly as you say, we might be clumsy, we might say I don't know exactly what to say, but sometimes silence and sitting with people's feelings, but ignoring a situation, is obviously incredibly difficult. One of the things which we all, I think, are working with is increasingly flexible, increasingly hybrid models of working, which means that we may not see people, we may not see changes in behaviours, we may not know whether it's the right time. Should I just pick up the phone? Should it be at the beginning of a meeting? How we do it. So any advice about how we can try to make sure that we don't that we get this right in the context where we're not necessarily seeing people in the office, where people are not necessarily coming back, into a space, that these things are having to happen virtually? Faith, do you want to go first?
Sure. I do think if we are working or having these conversations in a hybrid way, or over Zoom or Teams, we do have to be a bit more intentional with how we deliver that message. So I'm always very conscious, if I have a call with someone, to be a little bit more, don't want to say over the top, but more kind of expressive with the way I talk to them, because when we're together and in person, they can pick up on my body language, they can pick up on, the kind of energy that I'm bringing to that conversation. It might not be as easy to do that over Zoom or Teams. So I'll often kind of almost overemphasize that, really make sure they can see that I'm nodding, that I'm listening, that I'm, doing all those things that we know indicate that someone is listening to. And I think that's important. But I also think, be a bit creative with the way you have these conversations. I'm thinking back to a role I had before Hospice UK, where I did a lot of one-to-one support work. And I remember getting on a call with someone who'd recently been bereaved, and they didn't want to put their camera on. And I could hear in their voice, like their voice had that kind of horrible, like shakiness to it, where I could hear that he was on the verge of tears. And I said, you know what are we doing? This is not the right setting to do this. He was feeling really pressured to put his camera on. I had my camera on. I said, let's just have a Teams call. Like, do you live somewhere nearby where there's an outdoor area? And he said, yeah, I live opposite a park. I said, go walk around the park. I'll call you on the phone in 5 minutes, once you've had a minute to kind of catch your breath, and we'll carry on the conversation and just walk around the park with me, and we'll have this conversation. And just the relief in his voice of, okay, I don't have to look at this person that, let's be honest, he barely knew me. That was actually the first time we'd ever had a conversation. And I could hear as he was pacing around the park, he was getting his thoughts out. He could kind of finally actually have this conversation with me. So it doesn't, when we say remote, I think our minds immediately go to a Zoom call or a Teams call. It doesn't have to be that. It can be, I've had really great conversations with people over chat. I've had really great phone calls with people. Give people an option. If you can see that they're stressed, or this is not the right way for them to have this conversation, then suggest something else. It doesn't, there's lots of great technology these days. We can be more creative with the way we have the conversations.
Thanks, Faith. Aongola.
I think, just to reiterate and emphasize what Faith shared, the remote working dynamic is much more fluid now than kind of the presumed sitting at a computer and logging in and chatting to people. For me, it allows multiple ways to communicate with someone, and being able to utilize sometimes the nuances of that distance. People are more likely to open up immediately if the person that they are talking to, or the person sparking the conversation, isn't stood right in front of them. That extra second to think about what they want to type out, or to type the message, read it again for a split second to go, actually, I'm going to rewrite this, or I'm going to send this instead. And using that to our benefit, that people do have that extra minute or two to think about their response. And like Faith said, there are sometimes those meetings where we're expected to sit there with our camera on, and there might be a group of people. And knowing our team, and knowing the people around us, and like Faith said again, if we spot something that might be potentially concerning or we want to address, dropping someone a message and inviting them to having a conversation. And again, it's empowering that person to take control of sparking that conversation while creating that sometimes virtually safe environment. And if it means that you organize something as formal as, let's put something in our calendar in half an hour's time, or I have this 1 hour slot here and this other hour slot free later on, please feel free to put however much of that time you want to chat about things, or drop me a message. And sparking that conversation, and it might start from a quick back and forth in Teams or Slack or whatever you look, and then it can develop into, okay, let's jump into a call, because sometimes that call helps translate those the emotions. You can see someone's facial expression. Sometimes the little distractions, like I'll be having a difficult conversation and I'll invite my dog over, just to humanize that conversation as much as possible. And again, we don't want there to be such a separation between work and life, especially if someone is working around their home or around what's otherwise a really personal space to them. So yeah, if anything, to emphasize what Faith said.
Brilliant, thank you. And I guess the one thing that I would just add, as what I will often do, is just if I know that somebody in my organisation is experiencing, has experienced bereavement, or living with somebody who's terminally ill, whether it's partner or parent or friend or whatever, we'll just send a message via Teams, just saying, have been thinking about you. I hope that you found somebody in the organisation that you can talk to. It doesn't have to be a particular person. You're very welcome to come and talk to me if you want to. Remember, we've got X, Y, and Z in place, mental health first aiders, we've got the EAP, and we'll do that, and then we'll follow up if we're in the office. So I think we can all do things. It doesn't have to be two ways. Say, no need to respond, just want you to know that I'm thinking about you, so that people feel as though you have an emotional connection, and that they can connect and talk to you, because people will open up when they feel like they can trust you, and where there's empathy and understanding as well. So we've got some questions which are coming in through. Just want to try to address a couple of those if we can. So the first is around what if, while listening and supporting a colleague, you become emotional yourself? Do you conceal it or step away? I mean, I use chair's privilege here to just say, just sit with it. We're so frightened of our emotion, and what we mustn't do is make it about ourselves. But it is okay to become upset when we're having conversations with people. I had to communicate about a suicide into the organisation, and I could barely speak. And there was part of me that was saying, this is awful, you're not being a good leader, you're not being strong, and and I was like, actually, this is fine. This is just a human response, and we don't wear professional slippers and personal slippers, and sometimes things get us, and being human is probably the most important thing that we can do. Aongola, what would you say?
Exactly that. From the point of view of someone who is sharing their experience and the impact of that experience, sympathy in its kind of simplest and sometimes rawest form is seeing the person in front of you also kind of sympathizing, and sometimes that might mean, or you might see someone getting upset. As someone sharing that message, that's sometimes a good thing. That's, again, you understand that, okay, they understand what position I'm coming from, but also creating that space, and that if people are sharing something that's so impactful, it's understandable for it to impact us as well. So like you said, there isn't kind of a professional hat and an unprofessional hat when we experience those things. And as long as we continue to support the person who is sharing their experience and continue that conversation and not steer it in another direction or away from them, it's perfectly okay to experience those feelings. And if we do reach kind of a barrier or a hurdle in which we feel that, okay, this may no longer be a productive or supportive conversation, addressing that as well. There's always a continuation for a conversation that ends well.
Great. Thanks, Aongola.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting here trying to think, like, is there a way to get around it? And I just genuinely don't think there is. I'm thinking of, you know, lots of conversations I've had where I've got teary-eyed or choked up or really kind of, you know, just feels like your heart's like being ripped out of your chest as this person is telling the story to you. And it's, you know, I do think it's important to kind of recognize that and lean into that, because that means something about that story has touched you, and that can help kind of guide that conversation from a real place of kind of genuine empathy and compassion. So I think, you know, if it's ever getting too much, then I would definitely recommend, you know, ending the conversation in a kind of thoughtful way and maybe revisiting it at another time if you're personally getting quite overwhelmed with emotion, and potentially kind of signposting that person to somewhere else that they can speak to, or maybe someone that's more appropriate. If it's something that's quite a personal trigger for you, then sometimes we're unfortunately just not the best person to have that conversation with them. But also, you know, thinking back to when I was in a support role, I think, you know, it's really sweet. A lot of times people would say to me, you know, I'm worried about you. I've just like dumped all this information on you, and, you know, what happens to you now? And something that was really important for me to emphasize with them, which, I mean, this was in a professional capacity, so it may not be as applicable for everyone else, but I would remind them in that moment, you know, I have a supervisor, I have someone that I have to speak to and debrief, you know, all my caseload with, but you may mention that to someone in a kind of personal capacity as well. You know, I'm not going to share any details, I'm not going to share any of this information or share anything without your consent, but I have my support people as well. You know, I have people that I can go to in my community or my friends or my loved ones, and I will find a way to deal with this in my own way that works for me. So kind of almost reminding them that you have that support system as well, like you're being for them, so they're not they don't have to carry that guilt, because I do see sometimes that people feel quite guilty when you get upset. So I try to remind them that I will be okay. I have ways to cope, and that's why it's really important to know your coping strategies and know your kind of what works for you in terms of decompressing after those conversations. So yeah, if you have that plan in place, which hopefully everyone does after these, you know, honest, very vulnerable, sensitive conversations, then let that person know, and then they'll be reassured and they can kind of carry on with that conversation.
Great, thank you, Faith. And we have this question quite a lot with mental health first aiders who are being used more in organisations about, you know, what do they need to be able to know and what do they need to be able to do? And I think the really important part, whether you're a mental health first aider, whether you're a manager, is exactly as Faith says, is ensuring that we've got the support structures and systems in place in order to be able to get that, but without sharing information that others have. I'm conscious of time, so I'm now going to only ask one of you to answer the question. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to get through the questions. But if you feel that you've got something really burning that you want to add to it, then feel free to put your hand up. I just there's a question around sorry, here about networks, and I think, Faith, this is probably a question for you, which we're thinking of setting up a bereavement network. What pitfall and benefits have people found in setting this sort of thing up?
Interesting. So my first question to you would be, which I feel like I'm being quite challenging with some of my questions. I promise I'm not purposefully trying to be challenging. But my first question to you, which I always ask our own members, is why are you creating this network? Is it something that you have just decided that your organisation needs, or is it coming from a genuine place of, you know, employees specifically asking for a bereavement network in your organisation? If not, I would maybe take a look at, you know, where is this idea coming from? Is it something that people are asking for, or are there other kind of more professional, appropriate boundaried ways to implement that support? So that's things like an employee assistance program, trained mental health first aiders who, you know, have that support system in place. Is there other avenues that you could take those people? If you still come back and say, no, people are specifically asking us for this and they want it in place, then I would say make sure those boundaries are really clear, make sure people have support in place so that they're not kind of having a conversation that can be quite emotionally loaded and then going into a 2-hour meeting, for example. How are you kind of enabling them to balance that role with their day job? I think there can be a lot of benefits. I think peer support networks are really important. We see them as hugely important at compassionate employers, you know, people being able to lean on their peers, having a trusted person that they can talk to, or even just having a bit of an ally in the organization, you know, being able to see someone on their floor and go, okay, that person gets it, that person knows my story, I feel, you know, supported and seen in this organization. But I'd definitely be a little bit cautious of, yeah, exactly why you're setting up that network, and also how are you going to safeguard people. I come from a wellbeing, specifically safeguarding background, so I'm always very conscious of people's mental load that they're taking on at work, and whether we need to be giving them another role in the first place, or whether we can signpost elsewhere.
Great, thank you. So there's also a question here about different cultural faiths and backgrounds, and expectations around grief. And how can organisations make sure that the support they offer is flexible enough to adapt to this? And I guess the important bit is, how do in saying this, I think it feels as though it's always interesting, isn't it, that any one person has any one set way of facilitating grief. So I think this is a question about, how do we make sure that policies are flexible enough to enable people to grieve in the way that they want to grieve and will grieve. Aongola, do you want to have a crack at that one?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think the start is a common denominator that's based in inclusivity. A common denominator being a structure, an immediate response. Is it something that people need a specific amount of time off, or specific period in which they will be focused all of their attention and efforts elsewhere? Is it a policy or a structure that allows for people to sporadically be in and out of work because of an ongoing cultural process, or whatever it may be? So I think starting the really kind of foundational offering in inclusivity, and sometimes it's a really simple blanket statement. It's having an initial conversation with the manager and cancelling things for that immediate day, and addressing that first day, and asking. And I think that the safest space is if we have that that initial foundation that doesn't prescribe a way to do things, and ask and use the answers and use that conversation to help build that structure. Like you said, everyone's experience of death and dying is going to be different. And reading through the comments, a lot of people have shared that it isn't linear, that they are those kind of roller coaster of experiences and emotions. My own experience, because of that time difference, almost everything in that journey was remote, it was virtual, it was attending things via Zoom, it was broken phone calls, and whatnot. So that structure was physically different, but it was all rooted in that initial conversation of understanding that immediate first need, and asking. My manager simply asked, simply in inverted commas, because it's still a really difficult conversation. But yeah, it's avoiding creating that really prescribed structure. So though we may have the 3 days of compassionate leave, it's understanding that we may not use that immediately. Some people want to maybe spend that first day of aligning what their next week may look like, and planning ahead. Sometimes a funeral is within 24 hours or 2 days. of the death. So it's understanding that we may have the prescribed expectations of the amount of time, which is something sometimes way above anyone's decision to make or dictate. It's just how we use those.
Great, thank you. And if I can just jump in, I think it's again, I just want to take this back, isn't it? This is about human conversations. And so we're going to come on to a question about bereavement leave. So Faith, there's a question which is what do you see working well? I just want to just remind ourselves, all of us, that within this there are lots of options that we have, and really as workplaces think about how we enable people to live well, whether that's sometimes with a chronic condition, sometimes to manage as they go through separation and divorce, sometimes experiencing bereavement, whatever it is. We've always got options, and sometimes we think we go to the sickness policy or we go to the bereavement policy, but we also often have some discretion around whether people take more annual leave than they want, or whether they have unpaid leave, and we have phased returns, and we have sick leave. There's a whole range of different ways. Compassionate leave is one part of it, and I think I just encourage all of us to think about what is it that we have in our workplaces at our disposal in order to be able to facilitate good experiences for people in terms of the support that they have, those possibilities are endless if we look to create them. If we look with that lens of how do I best support somebody through this process, the opportunities for us are endless, and that process might be bereavement, it might be miscarriage, it might be through adoption leave, it might be all sorts of things, and we mustn't just get narrowly focused on one thing. Having said that, Faith, what's best practice on bereavement leave, and what would you like to see?
What would I like to see? It's an interesting question. So what we advocate for and what we encourage organisations to have is a minimum of 10 days paid bereavement leave. There's currently no legal requirement except for Jack's Law, which applies to parents who lose a child under the age of 18. So we would love to see organisations offering paid bereavement leave and being generous with that paid bereavement leave, because currently the average is 3 to 5 working days. It's just simply not enough by the time you've organised a funeral, or Aongola and I both have family overseas. By the time, it would take me 48 hours just to even get to New Zealand. So by the time I'm there, 2 of my days are already gone. So you have to be very conscious of even just the navigation of that. Like, can someone even physically get there in that amount of time? So we ask for 10 days paid leave minimum. We encourage people to break that up into hours, because as Aongola has mentioned, 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there, it all kind of adds up. When I was bereaved, didn't have these nice little perfect slots that I could give to someone and say, I'm going to need 2 days, please. Actually, it would have been much more beneficial for me to say, can I have 2 hours to go to this appointment, or can I have an hour to speak to a lawyer on the phone, rather than having to kind of take it in these quite prescriptive chunks. So being flexible with being generous with the amount of time you give, being flexible with when that can be taken. Think about whether you can offer pre-bereavement leave. So we know that people don't just grieve when someone has physically died, in the cases of dementia, or when someone is terminally ill. When you're anticipating a death, can you give someone bereavement leave or pre-bereavement leave at that point? And also being flexible of how long they can take that leave. So we talked about, the messiness of grief. They're not just going to need it in those first few days or weeks. They might actually want to take it off the first birthday that they have without that person, or the first, Passover, Christmas, Eid, whatever it is. They might want time to be with their family and think about that person then. So, be kind of conscious of those times as well. And I think, be something, I've looked at lots of bereavement policies, our own members and other people, and I've, worked and written a lot of policies. Be really mindful of the way you write it. I'm sometimes really shocked at the language we use. It can be so clinical and harsh. I've seen policies where people say, if one of your children dies, you get this. If 2 of your children dies, you get that. And you just think, who was like, you know, I get that policies have to be prescriptive, they have to be clear, they have to have boundaries, but, you know, read through it and think, if I was sitting in front of someone, would I feel comfortable saying this to someone's face? And if you wouldn't feel comfortable saying it, don't let them read it by themselves. It's really kind of as simple as that. Be sensitive, be human in your language. You know, if you're talking to someone whose child has just died, or their, you know, the love of their life had just died, and they're now sitting down to read a bereavement policy, think about that when you write it. It doesn't have to be, it can still have the same boundaries, it can still be professional, but, you know, write it in a way that you would want someone to receive that message, because that is your voice in there. As a HR team, as a whoever is writing that policy, that's your voice in there. So how do you want that to be received? I feel like I can talk about policies forever, but I'll stop there because I'm conscious of time.
Wonderful. Okay, that's great. And we are absolutely close to running out of time. So I am going to try to wrap this up. The first thing I say is we will summarise the resources and the information, and that will be circulated. So please don't worry about that, or you don't need to ask in the chat. We will do that, including information about the Compassionate Employers Programme, which would really encourage you to think about, find out about, and think about whether you can join from your organisation. I just also wanted to remind people that so often when we're thinking about this, we think about a parent or a brother or a sister or a partner. It might be a pet, it might be chosen family, it might be friends, it might be all sorts of connections. So, you know, there is no hierarchy of grief or bereavement, and there is no linear process, and we can and must find ways to connect and engage with that. I think it's also just really important to say at the end of this is about us being human beings in organisation. So when people say in our organisation we can only do this, our organisations are made up of humans. So what conversations do we need to have? With who do we need to have them in order to make sure that we enable people to continue to work, or to have space from work in something which all of us will experience at some point in our lives, and sometimes in all sorts of times and places that we weren't expecting to. So, you know, this is about managers and peers and cultures which facilitate relationship, and through relationship trying to do the best that we possibly can. But I also want to say thank you to all of you for joining us. There is, you know, the fact that there are so many of you shows that this is an issue which is close to your hearts, and really appreciate that. And together we can tackle the taboos and stigma about this issue, which is something which is absolutely a part of all of our lives. It's the only certainty we have through living, is that death will also be part of it. So 3 things just to ask you to do before we get to 12:30. One, we got a really good quiz for Dying Matters Week. Please do it and encourage others to do it as well. It's thought-provoking, it's fun, but it's also thought-provoking, and it's on the Hospice UK website on the Dying Matters pages. Share it all over your social media channels. Second, if you're not already signed up to Dying Matters, please do sign up for free webinars. Tell people about this webinar. Tell people anything, create the conversation. Make sure this webinar doesn't stop here. It creates ripples throughout. And then lastly, if you can just join me in thanking Aongola and Faith for being brilliant panelists, and to everybody who's worked so hard behind the scenes to make sure that this webinar happens as part of Dying Matters Awareness Week. And thank you very much for joining us. Have a very good rest of your day.